Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to King Camp Meeting 2020. I'm joined this afternoon by Dr. Michael Campbell. So good to have you this afternoon.
Thanks, Pastor Michael.
Absolutely. You're going to be talking to us today about the Adventist response to pandemic, and I'm super excited about that topic. But before we dive into that, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? Help us get to know you a little bit more.
Sure, absolutely. Basically, my story begins kind of as a young person. I got really excited about Adventist history. I met a guy by the name of Mervyn Maxwell, consummate Adventist historian and storyteller. And what he did is, as a young person, I remember him telling stories of the pioneers. And I suddenly realized they're not just people that I was reading about in a book from long ago, that they were real people whom God used and interacted with. And I said, you know, my dream as I read more and became more interested is to be an Adventist historian. So I was basically a young person. I kind of read more and more and just kind of grew. And so here I am today.
That's so cool. I think in all the interactions I've had with you as I've gotten to know you more, I've always appreciated your love for stories and your love for diving into what's happened in the past and how that applies to us right here, right now, and going forward in the future.
Absolutely.
So, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me.
And everybody watching at home, I've got my computer here. I'm going to be monitoring our chat boxes on Facebook and on YouTube, and we would love to hear your comments and your questions throughout this presentation. I'm going to turn the reins over to Michael here in a second. He's already kind of pulling on him a little bit, so I'm kind of holding him back. But we want to hear from you, and I'll also put up on the bottom of the screen for you a number. You can text in that number if you're comfortable that way. And when you text that number, I'll be able to see that. Don't try to call it, but I'll see your message. And if it's a question and we can get that woven into today's discussion, we'll be glad to do that. So glad everyone's here. I'm so thankful that you joined us this afternoon. And I'm very excited for what you have to present. And before we get in again, and maybe you're going to mention this and this kind of dives in, but what has led you to be knowledgeable of this topic about how Adventists have responded to pandemic in the past?
Sure. Well, basically, in a nutshell, about 15 years ago, I was working on my dissertation on the 1919 Bible Conference, Adventism and fundamentalism. So I was kind of trying to set the stage, the background for all of that. And one of the major events leading up to that was this whole series of epidemics that we now call the 1918 Spanish flu, or whatever you want to call it, but this influenza, this global pandemic. And so I wrote about it in my dissertation as background material. I honestly thought it was probably some of the least useful material, but I wanted to do a thorough job, so I did it. And of course now, some years later, here it is suddenly become very relevant for the moment today.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, without further ado, take us into what you have prepared for us today.
All right. Well, thanks, Pastor Michael. I want to begin by just encouraging our listeners here in the Keene community. As I was kind of doing a refresher preparing for this, I was reading through the old reviews from over a century ago during 1918 and 1919, and I found this very interesting clip, and it's by Eugene Farnsworth. And Eugene Farnsworth was kind of like the Mark Finley of 1918, 1919. He was a very polished evangelist, well-respected church leader. He was even a vice president of the General Conference. I think one of the very first vice presidents, and of course Mark Finley is vice president for evangelism. So he comes here to Keene for Keene Camp Meeting.
Wow.
1919.
So that's 101 years ago.
Exactly. And here he is writing about his experience visiting Texas here for this camp meeting. And so I just had to read this for our listeners here in the Keene community. He says this: the weather was hot.
It's hot today.
You can believe that, right?
Yes, I can believe that.
But as the meetings were held in the large church, great relief from the oppressiveness was afforded. And I can appreciate that. There's air conditioning in here today, so it's a bit cooler. Yep. The brethren and sisters attended all the meetings with commendable faithfulness.
Wow.
So online we're counting.
You guys have been faithful throughout this week, so we're checking it off.
Morning, afternoon, and night, they were nearly all there.
Wow. Okay.
And the house was well filled. That would have been this congregation.
Wow.
These brethren and sisters in the South are among the best and most patient listeners that it has ever been my pleasure to meet.
Wow.
I know, patient listeners.
Wow. Yeah.
No criticism whatever can be made in regard to their faithfulness in attending the meetings.
That's cool.
So there you have it. King Camp meeting just over a century ago in the midst of a pandemic.
Wow.
So
that's kind of cool to think about.
Just after. So, and I want to give a little bit of context here for our listeners here as to understand a bit, because today we don't really understand and appreciate what life was like over a century ago.
Sure.
I've been reading the autobiography of Joseph Wolf. I'm sure you've read The Great Controversy. Ellen White talks about him a lot. He's one of the harbingers, right along with William Miller and everybody else. And so having this COVID-19, I've had a little more time at home to read.
Just a little bit,
Just
right?
a little bit. And so I was reading through that, and it really struck me that, here he is in the 19th century. He's having to go through one part of the Middle East, and he's going through Europe and parts of Africa, and he was always facing pandemics. Pandemics all over the place. And he'd arrive in a city of port of somewhere, and in fact, one time he got shipwrecked. And he makes his way to shore and walks, I don't know how many miles, to the next port, city, wherever, and they say, okay, you're in quarantine. Can you imagine just barely surviving with your life? And then getting put into, I think it was like 28 days of quarantine because the plague was ravaging through the area, and they're afraid that if he came in, he could contaminate the city. So I, reading through that autobiography as I'm talking to our listeners, I lost track of just how many times that he had to be quarantined and was going through. And actually, there's kind of a funny story that I just want to tell our viewers. And that is Joseph Wolf one time was going through northern Persia, what we today call Iran. All this plague that's breaking out. So he knew that was a problem. So he packs all his own food, doesn't have any contact with anybody, and he's traveling through and makes it to the other side, gets to Tehran. Today it's still called Tehran. And resupplies and goes on to where he wants to get to his mission post. They're like, this crazy Christian missionary, what is he doing? And as they're going out, he's on this group of travelers as they are traveling out of the city, and I don't know how far out he was, but they get attacked, raiders, and this fierce tribe, several hundred horsemen, and they were known for killing everybody or making them slaves. And Joseph Wolf was very witty, very quick, and he jumps out in front of the caravan, the plague. And all of these people that were about to kill them suddenly realized, wait.
Oh, we don't want to go there.
Yeah, let's not go there. And so they turn around and run away, and their lives were spared. And so he writes about how his life had been saved by a pandemic. So a century ago, it's very interesting, people grew up in a world in the 19th century where pandemics were frequent. You could count on having experienced any of a number of pandemics during your lifetime. People would die from it, and this was very common. So
something that's kind of new and fresh for us that we don't have really any experience with was common practice, or not common practice, but it's very common for them.
And what do you think has made the difference?
Probably our modern medical, everything that goes into medicine today.
Modern healthcare, knowledge about germs and everything else, but especially immunizations.
Okay.
So this is kind of crucial to understand. A lot of these diseases that would plague humanity, and it's interesting that Adventists were at the cutting edge as medicine changed from the sort of, make it up kind of thing, all these remedies that sometimes were even lethal. I mean, mercury and lead and all of this kind of stuff. And Ellen White said that's crazy. That's quackery. All of that.
Does she actually say quackery?
I think she actually does. And she has actually some stronger words than that.
Okay.
I mean, it's basically these people are killing people. And stay away from it. Medicine is dangerous, and this is where a lot of Adventists have troubles. They take only those quotations, but they're not actually looking at the context of what's going on. But then at the end of her lifetime, as modern medicine changes, Ellen White clearly is embracing the best of modern medicine. Still we use natural remedies, the laws of health like sleep and rest and temperance and all of that, but it has clearly changed. In fact, a lot of Adventists are surprised to know that Ellen White was actually immunized towards the end of her life for smallpox. So she clearly supported these different changes in modern medicine that clearly have had a significant result in minimizing or mitigating the spread of pandemics. What I think is important for our listeners to know about is the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic was the last major global pandemic similar or that could be measured of any magnitude to what we've been going through with the COVID-19 here in America and around the world. And a lot of people don't realize it's been so long since we had a major pandemic. But over some historians, it's debated because the numbers are difficult to assess from different parts of the world. But historians vary anywhere from somewhere between 50 and 100 million people who died from the influenza in 1918, 1919, over a span of about 18 months.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
A lot of people. More people died from the influenza than World War I. So, I mean, think about this. You know, if you sent your child was overseas fighting in World War I, and then they go overseas and survive all of these battles, and then they suddenly perish at the very end of the war. Perhaps they were on one of the return boats. Here they are coming back to America. Their lives have been spared. You get a letter finding out that the war is over, your child is safe, only then to find out that on the return ride home, that they died from the influenza. In fact, some people even argue that that hastened and accelerated the end of the war. So it had a dramatic effect around the globe in ways that we scarcely can understand. I'll just give you another example. You know, Adventists were not immune from the 1918 influenza pandemic. One of the most interesting stories that I came across in reading through the review in the last few weeks, it kind of brushed up by going through and reading through again the reviews, and it's kind of fun to read. Maybe it's a little morbid, but the obituary section, you know, reading through all the obituaries, and you know it made a significant impact because you start reading all of the obituaries. And the General Conference minutes, they, you know, church workers, pastors, leaders, they're dying from the influenza. One of the most intriguing ones was a very popular Bible teacher and principal that was out in California. I think he was in the Modesto area, as I recall. He had immigrated to America from New Zealand and had been trained, went overseas as a missionary, went back. So here he had suffered some, you know, went through some pretty tough things, and only to die tragically from the influenza. Unbeknownst to him, only a few weeks before, his sister, also now back home in New Zealand, had also died. So there are two obituaries, brother and sister, world apart, halfway around the world, both of them dying tragically of the influenza. So it made a tremendous impact around the globe and among Seventh-day Adventists. So just to give you another quick example, Emmanuel Missionary College, here at Southwestern Adventist University, we finished off the semester in a way that we weren't really planning to. We got up to about spring break, and suddenly there's all these announcements about schools needing to close. And of course, Southwestern, like every other university, and including all of our Adventist colleges, goes to online, shifts to online. Well, they didn't have online back then, but they did the best that they could. And so schools did close, elementary schools as well as academies, colleges, evangelistic meetings that were in progress. I've read numerous reports and accounts of evangelistic meetings that are partway through, and then suddenly the local government has a stay-at-home order and meetings are over. That's it. We're done for the next 6 weeks or however long that the stay-at-home order is at. And Adventists were urged, please follow the laws of the land. And I think there's something different about what's going on today versus 100 years ago. Recently, as I've been following social media, I see a lot of Adventists that are like, having to have churches closed, like our own Keene Church and other churches having to have online services. Is this a question of religious freedom?
Right. That's been big.
Right?
That's been big.
All over the place. Yeah. And it's interesting, 1918, 1919, no one was wondering that. Because it was all a matter of public health and safety. Adventists realized that, we need to be not waiting to be forced to have to close our churches and schools. We need to be proactive. We need to care about our communities. And I think a lot of them had experienced a number of pandemics themselves. So they were much more cooperative. It wasn't, this is big government trying to force us to close.
Right.
This is something we should do. And so church leaders are writing. In fact, a few of them hint at this and basically say, hey, this is not a question. We're closing all churches and schools. We're not just closing Adventist churches. So this is not apocalyptic. This is not the end of the world like our eschatology that we believe. This is, and it's definitely not a matter of religious freedom. We need to be, Adventists, we're known for our health message.
Right.
So of all people, we should be concerned about people's health, helping people to get better. Yeah. Anyways, I have a picture here on the screen, and I want you guys to see this. Emmanuel Missionary College. This is actually a picture that I found from the 1918-1919 school year. And it's a picture of, unfortunately, I could only find the girls' dorm. I don't know why. But there it is. There's a picture of the ladies, at least. I tried to get one of the whole school. Yeah. And it mentions that particular school year, they had an average enrollment of about 320 students, which was typical for Emmanuel Missionary College, the predecessor to Andrews University. So you have those 320 students, but as the epidemic kept coming through, the average attendance, they said, of students was more like about 250. So you can understand that. That pandemic comes through. Hey, if my mom and dad live close enough, I'll go home and stay there until the pandemic, until things start getting better. It mentions that there were 125 students that got sick, of which 4 died. So just by the fact that you're Adventist isn't going to save you from necessarily influenza, following the health message and all of that. And so Adventist leaders were trying to wrestle with that, thinking through, this is really important that people pay attention, that not to take unnecessary risks. And it's intriguing to me. In fact, the school leadership, they write there were heavy financial losses due to the drop in enrollment, as you can only imagine. Yeah. So it was clearly a crisis that Adventist institutions were facing. Another thing that I find very interesting is that now this is before social media, and there were a lot of very strange ideas about how to cure the influenza. Sound familiar?
Yeah, it does. Curious to see what people were thinking of back then.
And so I just put one in here. This was actually published by a church leader, so this is in the review.
Oh, wow.
And but basically, this is being recommended by L.L. Cavaness, one of our, in fact, religious liberty leaders and editors. He writes, and it's a friend of his apparently sent this to him and said it works. And it's encouraging people to get a pinch of common sulfur and put it on a coal of fire on a hot stove, and then to sniff it. And you say, you don't have to worry about getting addicted to it because it smells so terrible that you're not going to get addicted to it, but it could cure you from the influenza. So there you have it. And it says that, and it even refers to it as a small child, a 2-year-old child could help treat their parent doing this. And I was having a hard time picturing a little 2-year-old getting a little thing of sulfur and putting that on the coals to make a poof of smoke. Yeah. And who does that? Yeah. But it's published in the review as a recommended remedy for the influenza. I don't think that worked.
So do you mean we as Adventists don't necessarily always get it right?
I think you're onto something there. That, it doesn't mean that we're infallible. We're searching for treatments. People, and think about it, the anxiety level, your friends, fellow church members, people that have gotten it have died. Right. And there's no cure, no known cure. Right. What do you do? So you're eager and anxious for anything that you might be able to put on there. We were doing, in fact, you joined us for some of the episodes in the theology department of ministry in the midst of pandemic. And we interviewed some pastors as part of that series, including one pastor that in his church alone had lost 11 church members. Wow. And I just read a report today. The New York City Adventist churches have lost nearly 200 church members from the COVID-19. Yeah. So it is, in these different places, especially the hot spots, it's making a huge impact. We need to be aware and sensitive. And suddenly this COVID-19, I've talked to a number of people, it's a conspiracy, all of these kinds of things. Well, it is until you actually get it or somebody actually comes down from it and dies from it. And suddenly you're like, well, what you saw on the news that seemed so far away suddenly becomes much more tangible. Right. The other interesting challenge that our church was facing back in 1918, 1919, conspiracy theories.
No way. No way.
Can you imagine?
Who would have known?
Who would have known? All kinds of stuff. And, I get it. I get why conspiracy theories, because some conspiracy theories turn out to be true.
Mm-hmm.
There are some things, we don't always know everything. There are sometimes people, but oftentimes, if it's too good to be true, it usually is.
Too good to be true.
Yeah. And so in 1918, 1919, people were searching for answers, and one of the most popular conspiracy theories was that this was a German-made virus that they brought over on U-boats, the German submarines, and planted it and infected people in America to try to sort of biological warfare, and very early version of biological warfare. So that was one of the very popular. Obviously, it's been long ago discredited. This is fanciful thinking, but it is intriguing to me that both Adventists 100 years ago and today had a challenge with all of these conspiracy theories. I think maybe social media has accentuated that and made that a little bit more of a challenge, but it is what it is. People are searching for answers, trying to get a grasp of what is going on. L.A. Hansen, I want to quote him, and he writes an article titled "The Influenza Precaution," published in the Review and Herald in 1919, and he urges, and against these conspiracy theories and these fanciful treatments, that Adventists be careful and be prudent and exert good judgment and common sense in how they should handle the pandemic. And so I'm not going to read all of this here, but he mentioned several things that I think are very significant. One of them is to avoid undue fear. You don't have to be afraid unnecessarily of it. You don't have to be so afraid that you stay at home and you're absolutely terrified. It is a disease and it's bad, but we shouldn't allow fear of the disease to cripple our efforts to do ministry to others. And that was one of the, I think, really significant things of the 1918, 1919. And Hansen goes on later, and W.A. Rubel, who's the medical director of the General Conference, he actually says, as Adventists, because we are a people of hope, we don't have to be afraid if we die. We know what will happen. Jesus is coming. This is an opportunity to share Jesus with others. Right. And so don't let us let that cripple us from helping those who are sick in our midst. Right. Our neighbors, our friends, students, faculty. If they're sick, let's help them.
Right.
So I like that. And of course he goes on, in addition to urging good common sense, proper safeguarding. And he explains what that is. We today call that social distancing. Right? A little bit, keep a good amount of space between those around you.
Right, which
word?
Yeah.
Although I think we what I remember reading is about 3 to 4 feet, not the 6 feet today. So I think we're good by 1918 standards.
Yeah.
But but yeah.
Just depends on which measuring rule you want to use, right?
Right, yeah. The other thing I think our listeners might be interested to know is they're encouraging people to cover their mouths and wear masks.
Really?
And of course they didn't have these fancy reusable ones that we can get now and wash and everything. Right. So they encourage people, especially if you knew you're going to, like nurses and doctors especially, should wear face masks, and at the end of the day when you're done seeing patients or whatever, to burn them, or even sometimes to burn them in between patients. So they're trying to practice, excuse me, sorry, it's my bad. But to practice good hygiene and to make sure that we don't get too close to one another. Sorry, Michael.
But you turned towards me and the microphone to cough.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. That was really bad. Anyways, but try not to do what I just did. But he goes on to say, the present disease situation is recognized as a serious one, and all persons are urged by the highest medical authorities to give careful heed to every precautionary measure. Don't be frightened. Simply take good care of yourself and help to safeguard others. So there you go. Use some good common sense, social distancing, help those that are sick. I mean, some of these kinds of things. And here's an example of Adventists doing that. Hutchinson Theological Seminary, Some of our listeners may not be aware, but 100 years ago, we had a lot of immigrant groups, but most of them were from like Scandinavia and different places, and we had large populations in the United States, and so it was deemed really important to reach those populations. So they actually had organized, I think, 3 different seminaries to reach these large immigrant populations. And Hutchinson Seminary in Minnesota, I think, was largely Norwegian, as I recall. I'm going off the top of my head. And there were about 180 students. A lot of them were preparing to be pastors, to be teachers. And during the midst of the 1918-1919 school year, nearly half of the students got sick. Now, here's the kicker. 180 students, half get sick. How many do you think die? None. You're right. Yeah. You may have seen it before, but yeah, okay. But yeah, and what's amazing, and this is during the influenza pandemic, went through 3 major cycles. Now, I should mention a little bit of background on the 1918. Sometimes it's the 1918 influenzas. Sometimes it's called the Spanish flu.
Right.
It's a misnomer because by all historical accounts, it apparently started in Kansas. We're not sure exactly how, but in rural Kansas, of all places. This has nothing to do with Spain or the Spanish or anything else, but they got blamed for it.
Interesting.
And so anyways, it went through a number of waves because the disease, just diseases always have throughout millennia. Sometimes they adapt and change and morph. And that's exactly what happened is as the disease... And what's intriguing is that it affected young people. Older people tended to actually recover more readily. But young people that are in the 20s and 30s at the peak of life and vitality, you would not expect. They're the ones that tended to die the most. So that's why we lost a lot of troops at the end of the war from the pandemic.
Do they know why that was?
It had to do with the strong virulent attack, and what it would do is, and especially at a strong healthy immune system, is it would your body would overreact to it, and so it would bring on a very violent response. And so oftentimes you would come down with the flu after being exposed to it within a matter of hours, certainly within 24 hours, and that's what made that pandemic so deadly. Is it was just so contagious, and really that's what ended the influenza pandemic, is it spread so rapidly around the world that eventually it killed itself out.
Oh, wow.
So, and we don't have any, biological, no one saved any blood samples, so we don't have any way to test it and compare it. Some people have actually been up to Siberia where it spread all the way up there, looking in frozen corpses to try to see if they could identify the disease. No one has successfully been able to do that. But basically it was so terrible, so virulent, before they could even develop a vaccine, the disease killed itself and it went through 3 major waves. And so when this is happening is the second of those 3 waves, that's when the most people died, is in this wave. And what they did is that they isolated students as they got sick, put them in isolation in their dorm room. No one could see them except for one person that was taking care of them, who had to be, very well, carefully masked up and everything else, and bring them food and give them hydrotherapy treatments. But by being very intentional about those treatments, they didn't have a single student at Hutchinson Seminary die.
Wow.
So that to me is very interesting. And again, that doesn't mean that by using hydrotherapy that you have a guarantee that you're not going to get the influenza or that you will necessarily get better. And they're not even saying that there. But certainly it decreased the percentages, the mortality rate.
Right. And
so whereas the national mortality rate was anywhere from 5 to 10% across the country of those infected, so that gives you some kind of range.
Yeah.
Adventists were somewhere in the 2 to 3% range.
Wow. And that simply dropped down because of lifestyle, the tenets of the health message of the Adventist Church.
Exactly. Treatments, hydrotherapy treatments, the laws of health that we tend to talk about from Adventist history and our health message and all of that. So, and again, even this report and others like them, well, they were successful. They didn't have any students die here. They did have students die at Andrews, basically, at Emmanuel Missionary College. So you have to keep that in mind. And we have evidence of many other Adventists that did tragically die from the influenza. I have here a picture of one of these influenza treatment centers. I find this very interesting to see. This particular one is a treatment, a medical center. Today, just like 100 years ago, there weren't enough hospital beds, especially in hot spots where the disease had really spread. And so people were having to turn schools and other places into hospital extensions to treat the number of patients. It just spread so quickly. And this was actually published in the review 100 years ago. Don't fall a victim to the flu. 10 rules for saving yourself and others, okay? I thought this was clever. Number 1, avoid people who are coughing or sneezing. So, Pastor Michael, that's
Sorry,
me.
just go ahead and take my exit now.
Yeah, right now. Do not attend crowds or large gatherings indoors or outdoors.
Okay.
That kind of makes sense.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah. And this is the one I was telling you about, right?
Yeah.
Number 3, keep 3 feet from any person talking.
Okay.
So 3 feet.
Okay, 3 feet,
Yeah.
you got it.
Number 4, when you cough or sneeze, cover your nose or mouth with a handkerchief or turn your face downward. Well, I did turn downward, so but yeah. But cover your mouth, you know. And number 5, don't use a cup or other eating utensils used by others without thoroughly washing or boiling it. So sanitizing.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Don't touch, especially things that. Number 6, don't put into your mouth fingers, pencils, or other things that do not belong there. You can see they're thinking about students.
Yeah.
Yeah. Number 7, wash your hands before eating. Lots of hand washing. 8, eat plenty of simple, nourishing food. I think this is actually kind of interesting because a lot of people died in the influenza pandemic. People were afraid of them. They'd die in their own house because they weren't able to get nourishing food and treatment.
Yeah.
There was a family that I talked to recently that had sort of an oral memory of going through this pandemic. And the father, what he did is their friends and neighbors around them, as they all came down with the influenza, what he did is every day he made a big pot of vegetable stew and dropped off a portion at each of his sick neighbors' homes because they were too sick, too weak to be able to cook any nourishing food for them.
Yeah.
For themselves. And so that was his way of doing ministry. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a nurse, but he knew at least if they could get some nourishment, that they would hopefully increase their chances of surviving. And his neighbors apparently did survive, did make it through, or at least most of them did, according to the anecdotal story. So kind of interesting. There's still a number of people that families that were impacted by this malady from a century ago. Number 9, sleep and work in rooms filled with fresh air, but keep the body warm. And number 10, if you get influenza, go immediately to bed to ward off the pneumonia. In other words, isolate yourself, self-isolate. Yeah. Don't spread it with others or to others. And Adventist worked really diligently. It's intriguing to me a century ago as it impacted the Seventh-day Adventist Church that they were looking at ways that they could take their health message and be able to share that with others. And so our church developed a number of outreach magazine special editions, including pamphlets. This is an advertisement for one of them titled Epidemics, How to Meet Them. This was a bestseller in 1918. And so they printed hundreds of thousands of copies of these, as you can see here as it's advertised, so that you could send it to your friends and neighbors, because the influenza had been through once, it went through twice, went through 3 times as it morphed and people would get sick again. And so how many more times is it going to happen? Right. How many times can people be reinfected? This is still a question we're asking ourselves now. I mean, scientists are debating this. I'm not a medical scientist, so I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I'm watching and reading very carefully the literature as people are studying this issue, right? Right now. Are we going to see multiple waves of the COVID-19? I don't know. Right. But it certainly happened in 1918, 1919, and they knew they'd been through 3, and people were wondering, they're asking themselves the same question: am I going to have to go through this the rest of my life? Am I going to continue having to deal with this pandemic? And people are feeling rather weary. You see enough people die, and it happens again, and 6 months later it happens a third time. It's very distressing. You can see there's a lot of angst going on within society at that time. F.M. Wilcox, and I just found this picture of him this last week. I think this is kind of interesting. I just love his editorials as I was reading through 1918, 1919, through the reviews. Just very practical, very sensible, very spiritual. Yeah. And he writes in the review, one of our thought leaders of our denomination, as we still have the Adventist Review and Adventist World. I hope all of our keen listeners, you subscribe and pay attention to that. It's a way to know what's going on in our denomination back then as it is now.
Right.
And, he writes about this pandemic. He says, it's high time that Adventists become intelligent in the employment of the rational remedies and a system of treatment of which, as a denomination, we have had knowledge of for many years.
So he's advocating for a proactive response.
Absolutely.
Saying we as Adventists, we've been given this message.
Yeah.
Ellen White's talked about this. We got it from the Bible.
Yeah.
We need to be a people who's stepping up and leading the charge.
Yeah. And again, he also writes, it doesn't mean that some of you in the process of that might not get sick and even die.
Yeah.
But even if that were to happen, as Adventists, we're called to minister to those around us. We're called to live the health message, to minister and put the betterment of others before ourselves. Yeah. That principle there that I just sense over and over and over again, I just behooves me. I admire that commitment and willingness to sacrifice, if need be, to make sure that we are a living witness to others.
Right.
And in fact, later on, some of our church leaders, I see this similar kinds of statements and restatements, but basically the idea that there were 10 times the number of opportunities to share with others if only we had been ready.
Wow.
So we may not have schools and churches, we may not have public evangelistic meetings, but if we were willing to be flexible and adapt, we had 10 times the number of opportunities that we might not ordinarily have otherwise.
Wow.
Anyways, F.M. Wilcox, he goes on to say, every Seventh-day Adventist may obtain a knowledge of these principles so that he can apply them in his own home. In other words, we've got this health message. Live it, use it. This is the time to do so. He says one more thing here. We do not by any means take the position that obedience to these principles will ensure immunity, as I just mentioned, against disease or death. But live, he says, and exercise an intelligent faith, taking prudent steps to combat disease. In other words, go out, minister to others, but don't do so if you're going to jeopardize their health.
Right.
Cough the right way this time.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And
so it's being smart about what, using the knowledge that God has given us and being smart.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Don't go, it's not the time to go, well, this virus isn't going to affect me because I'm covered by the blood of Jesus and I'm just going to waltz into any place and I'm come to save everybody. But it's not the time also at the same time to be like, not going out anywhere, not touching anybody, not doing anything. And I think that is the particular crux that our church has faced in the middle of this. And at least in our area, we're kind of on coming out of it a little bit.
Right.
But I think it's telling for us as we see what some of these Adventist pioneers went through in the early 1900s to see, okay, how do we react to this?
Right. And I would even go so far as to say go a little bit farther. We're being urged to wear masks if possible, especially out in public. Yeah. And I know some people are saying, well, it's my right not to have to wear a mask. Well, it's true. It is your right not to have to wear a mask. But if my reading of Adventist history and of our church leaders and the literature, they're absolutely crystal clear. It's not about your rights. It's about putting the welfare of others before yourself.
Right.
In other words, we care so much about our community and their health, someone else's health. As a Christian, we put their welfare before our own. And, that's the spirit I see being reiterated again and again and again. And I'm not saying it's not, I perfectly agree. It's people's rights to do as they wish. But wouldn't it be wonderful as Adventists, we're known as being the most caring people, that we care so much. I want to make sure that all of my friends and neighbors and the people I work with, that you're safe. I'm going to put your health and welfare before my own.
Right.
All right. Well, I want to go on to a few more things here to just highlight some really great material from 1918, 1919. It brought a lot of anxiety. People were wrestling. People were struggling. People were dying. It was not a fun time to be alive. In fact, some of the research shows that Of course, whenever there's a pandemic, usually the population increases afterwards. A lot more people are at home, so there
more
tends
time on your hands.
More time on your hands. Although there's obviously a tragic loss of life in the short term. So you do see those kinds of things. So there's these sort of patterns that you see. But of that boom of babies that were born in around 1918, 1919, more of them tended to be shorter, more health problems. Than the generation, 10, 15 years before, or even, afterwards, 10, 15 years later. Yeah. So it did have far-reaching effects. Sometimes we don't always recognize the immediate impact of the pandemic, but clearly there was a larger impact that with 100 years we can see much more readily. Emergency work. The Church General Conference votes this is the General Conference Executive Committee, October 11, 1919. They actually urged that churches should organize for what was called emergency work. In other words, every local church had a responsibility to do something about the pandemic. They recommended, and I quote, "In times of epidemic or other serious health emergencies, everything possible that should be done by conferences to rally our churches and to prepare them for meeting the needs of our own people and to render help to others by calling upon our available doctors and nurses to instruct and direct in such work, giving the emergency needs as prompt and full attention as the situation may demand." And I found at least 3 different ways that our church responded to the pandemic. First of all, you start to see in the midst of the 1918-1919 pandemic, the assignment of health personnel at the union, at the conference, and at the local church, especially in local churches. Up until this pandemic, I don't see and we have this, I'm sure a Keene Church has this, you have a health ministries director. I've been a pastor for a number of years. Every church I've had a health ministries director. It's in the church manual. Well, up until this pandemic, we didn't have a health ministries director in the local church. This is a direct result of this pandemic a century ago. And so it's one of the lasting ways. So we at the conference office, we have a health ministries director. I know at the union, we have a health ministries director. Having people assigned, people began to realize it's not enough to just say we have the health message, but we need to, all levels of the church organization need to have people that are intentional about educating church members and their communities about health. This is a direct result of this pandemic a century ago. The other thing I found very intriguing, and this surprised me, was that Adventist a century ago in this pandemic were looking at liaisoning or collaborating with other organizations that were providing relief efforts. This really surprised me because I know Adventists, we believe in the remnant and everything else and we're God's elect and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that did not stop them, especially in the midst of a health crisis, working with other health organizations. And American Red Cross was featured numerous times in the review from a century ago, and leaders at all levels of the church were talking about, the American Red Cross has been doing all this great work during the war.
Right.
But wait a minute, they can also do all these great relief efforts with the influenza pandemic. Let's partner with them.
That's novel.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And if they're doing a great work, let's support them. And if they want to help us, let's be willing to accept their help.
Right.
That really surprised me. I was not expecting to find that, but there it was in the historical record.
Wow.
Well, we're getting a few more things I want to mention. W.A. Rubel, at the beginning of our presentation, I talked about him. He's the Health Ministries Director for the General Conference. He is the one that's really urging our church leaders avoid these fanciful kinds of treatments, use common sense, don't be afraid, practice good hygiene, social distancing, those different verbiage, but those ideas. And he says every young person, every member of our denomination, old or young, male or female, might have been busy night and day during the present epidemic if they had been prepared. In other words, just because schools and churches close doesn't mean the work of the church has to stop.
Yeah.
If we make an idol over the fact that we have to physically meet with one another, that's not what the body of Christ is. It's not a building.
Right.
It's a group of people.
Right.
And most important thing that happens in times of crisis is to make sure the body of Christ not only takes care of themselves, but they reach out to their communities around them. Over and over and over again, our church leaders are admonishing people a century ago, please don't miss out on opportunities. And I think about this myself. I live in a small community not far from here, and I knew who my neighbors were on either side of me. But suddenly, during the last couple months, I'm getting to know the neighbors across my street, and not, almost all the way down both sides of my street, because we're out walking in their home too. And suddenly, I know their names, and there's the elderly lady across the street who has no children, and she's in her 80s, and calling her up, how are you? Are you okay? Do you need groceries? Stuff like that. And suddenly we have a relationship that's forming.
Yeah.
And by the way, what church do you go to? These are just simple little ways. And I'm not even trying to be evangelistic. It just happens naturally.
Right.
And I think that's what they're talking about is, in the midst of a crisis like this, you have an opportunity to share Jesus like you would never have before or after. And so this is the time for the body of Christ to shine. And our churches are closed. All of these different kinds of things are happening. And in fact, he even titles his article, "What Are You Going to Do About It?" I like that, Don't let the pandemic stop you from being the body of Christ, from sharing Jesus Christ with those around you. This is absolutely essential. This is what we're all about as Adventists, is sharing the everlasting gospel.
Absolutely.
And then I want to finish by quoting Psalm 91. My wife's professor is writing a book on this psalm. It's very interesting because in times of pandemics throughout history, this has been the psalm that a lot of people have talked about, and it's quoted numerous times by our pioneers. Ellen White makes several hundred references to Psalm 91, very intriguing. And this one particular missionary in 1919, he's writing about this. And of course, the influenza, it affects people in America, but in South America, New Zealand, literally all around the globe. It was a truly global pandemic thanks to mass transportation.
Yeah.
Now, it's a little different today. We have airplanes. They didn't have airplanes back then, or at least not commonly practiced. But
not for commercial flight.
Not for commercial flight, but you could make it around the world fairly easily on a steamer and trains and everything else. So it was able to spread much faster than ever before on a global scale. And that's what makes this pandemic so intriguing and yet so deadly. And he goes through Paraguay, which was a very remote mission field at that time. Yeah. And intriguing, he goes, wades through waters, through marshes. He gets pulled along in a boat by oxen through these remote areas, waits on a platform for a day for a boat to go to another place. I mean, very, very difficult place to reach. He gets to the town of San Miguel in Paraguay. I haven't been there myself, but I love the whole story. And then finally gets home after that to the mission station. And he says, praise the Lord that... he says, what the 91st Psalm, it says, is true. Under the wings of the Almighty, we are well protected. May we trust more and more in his promises at this time. Wow. I love this because this, claiming Psalm 91, these other promises, we don't know what the future has to hold. But in the midst of this influenza pandemic, as it impacted Adventism a century ago, they claimed the promises of God. They didn't allow ministry to others to stop, even how the ministry itself changed. Right. But they still allowed themselves to be used by Jesus.
Right. And it seems like throughout all of this, bless you.
Thank you.
Seems throughout all of this, the focus has been on adapting to what's going on and not letting a certain set of negative circumstances that's totally tragic and horrific sway the mission of the church.
Yeah.
Because I think the mission of the church stands eternal.
Yeah.
The method, that shifts and changes by culture and place and everything else.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get enamored with the method of how we share the gospel and forget about the mission and the message that's behind it.
Exactly.
So, wow. Thank you so much for sharing this afternoon. And I want to open it up now to anybody at home. If you've got any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Campbell, we've got him sitting here right now. You can't see the shackles that are around his feet right now, but he's not going anywhere, at least for the next 12 minutes. And we want you to write in your questions. So go ahead and send those in to us. I'll be kind of watching here. Everybody's kind of stayed quiet. Got about 100 viewers that are watching right now, just so you know, Michael. So would love for any of those questions to come in. And there's a little bit of lag, about 30 seconds between when I say that and people hear that. So the question that I have, and you touched on it a little bit, what are some practical ways that we can balance the faith versus fear complex? In one side of the ditch being, I'm trusting completely in God.
Yeah.
This virus isn't going to touch me because I'm covered by the blood of Jesus. And the other ditch of, I can't go anywhere, can't do anything. I've got to mask everything, the whole nine. How do we practically balance that as Seventh-day Adventist Christians?
Well, that's a very difficult, and it's a very pragmatic aspect. So I wouldn't want to speak for all Adventists. Of course, in Adventist history, today, just like back then, I'm sure there were people on both sides of that where, some people are, for good reason, very fearful. People were dying very quickly. There are accounts of the influenza where someone caught the influenza going on in the way to work and died on the streetcar on the way home. So literally in a matter of hours.
Wow.
It had that kind of rapid response. You can see why people were justifiably very concerned about it. It was deadly. And but at the same time, what I think I see a lot of Adventists being reminded of is that even if we get the disease, we don't have to be afraid of death and dying. And so if it means that my going and ministering to someone else to take care of them means my risking my life, I can do that because God calls me to do that, to minister, to sacrifice my own welfare for the benefit of others. That's what God's selfless love, that's what Jesus himself did, right? He came from heaven, a very safe and secure place, came to this earth, sacrificed his life on Calvary for us. So that's part of the principle of the gospel that's there. So with that motivation behind as a context, Adventists are being urged, recognizing it's a very contagious disease and understanding germs, but I read in the review numerous times, we're hoping for a cure. We're hoping for a immunization. But so far, no immunization has proved successful, one writer in the review actually noted. So they haven't been able to find a cure. And so that meant that be careful. That's why all of these restrictions are posted in there. Social distancing, cover your mouth, avoid large gatherings of people. All of these are good hygiene, good practices, stay healthy, but don't be afraid. You don't have to be so afraid of the disease. You don't have to be afraid of, because you're not afraid of, you don't have to be afraid of dying because Jesus loves you. He's already died for your sins. You can claim Jesus' death on Calvary. So don't throw your life away foolishly.
Right.
But at the same time, if God calls you to minister to those around you, and you may not be able to, not everyone can. There are some people immune compromised, have significant health challenges. They probably shouldn't be the people taking care of those who are sick.
Of course. Right.
But to the best of your ability, that God calls us to minister to others, to look for opportunities to share and take care of those around us. And so I think that's that balance is use good common sense and prudence and good judgment based on the best medical knowledge that you can obtain and that is out there. And use some discretion too. Avoid fanciful theories and conspiracy theories and fanciful treatments, both back then as well as today. I mean, that's a problem. But most of all, our primary motivation is the gospel of Jesus Christ, God's love, that I care so much for God, whoever God has placed within my sphere of influence, that I'm going to do my very best to take care of them.
Yeah, and for me, the words of Jesus ring in my ears: "Be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves."
I like that.
And there's the kind of balance of, we're taking science into account and what the studies have been showing. We're also acting in faith. And you mentioned that it's not me focused. All of this response is not about what I'm going to do to stand up. No, what's God called you to do? How are you helping other people throughout that? And I think that's for each and every one of us very unique and depends on our own relationship with God.
Absolutely.
We've had a couple people comment in here, no questions so far, which is okay. I think you've done an excellent job of explaining everything. Don Beeson wrote in and he said the Keene Church Food Bank has been an excellent example of how to take care of your neighbor during these turbulent times.
I love it.
And I appreciate you, Mr. Beeson, for writing that in. We as a pastoral staff, when this thing came around and the governor of Texas said, hey, kind of shut things down, the county was like, hey, kind of shut things down. We were working with Tarrant Area Food Bank to keep our food bank open. They said, no, we're essential service, and we saw it as an excellent time that we could minister to 300 to 350 families every other week that wouldn't come and sit in our building for worship service, but they'll come and receive some food. Maybe a little smile, the little gesture might bring them back in the future, but it might be just what they needed right then, right now, to have a little bit of rest from the crazy life that they were living as they were maybe laid off, not knowing, wondering where their next meal is going to come from. All of those things. Right. I think that, and I have to say thank you to those of you that are watching that helped out with that. We so very much appreciate what you've been able to do for our community.
And keep doing it too.
Yeah. And it doesn't stop just because the virus is gone. I don't know, the lockdowns are lifted, all that kind of stuff. We still continue forward. And I think the other principle that I'm picking up from you today is that as much as we can learn from what happened in 1918 and 1919, we can even learn from what's happened over the past couple months. And look at recent history and say, okay, where was our church in March of 2020? And now where is our church in June of 2020? And how do those things look different? And what do we need to do to pivot in the future for true missional congruence with what the gospel describes as what we should be doing?
This reminds me of those statements, 10 times the number of ministry opportunities. So, and I've heard, you've had a significant increase in the number of people coming. And I think that's beautiful because there's a real need here in this community around us. And what a great way in the midst of a crisis to share God's love. And I think also the what I'm hearing you also talk a little bit about, which is sort of a theme, and that's flexibility, being willing to change and pivot or whatever you want to call it. But that means sometimes doing things a little bit differently than maybe in getting out of our comfort zone a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, before we go this afternoon, there's just a couple more comments that have come in. If you've got a question you want to bring in right at the last minute, we'll do our best to answer that. Harley Larkin, who I know has done a lot of missionary work down in Mexico, says even in Mexico, evangelism is different than in the U.S. Sure. And so I think that the idea of the pandemic applies even across cultures.
It does.
That we minister differently in pandemics, and how we minister here in Texas can be different than any other country or state that we go to, depending on culture, climate, what's going on.
It's definitely true. Yeah.
And there's several people I'll mention are very appreciative from what you have brought today. Someone writes in and says, I really enjoyed learning about the Adventist point of view of the 1918-1919 pandemic. It's amazing how much of this history can relate to today. And Michelle wrote in and said that.
Oh, thank you.
And somebody also texted in and said, Adventist Community Services continues to have significant connections with others in disaster relief.
It does.
As well.
Yeah.
And so we as a church have historically responded in crisis. And that's meant the world to a lot of different people.
And by the way, I was a missionary overseas for almost 6 years in the Philippines. And, we have the work of ADRA today. ADRA didn't really form until World War II. So it's kind of a generation later. But you can start to see the impetus of through these kinds of crises is that the church realizes we need to be more intentional in organizing. And so and the director of ADRA, while we were over there, really appreciated how I really never appreciated ADRA as much as when I was actually over there and saw up close and personal, seeing them respond to disasters and how they were always cutting edge at leading the way and working alongside other relief agencies. And so we have a long track record that we can do good work, but we don't have to be afraid of what other people are doing, and we can collaborate and partner together and still be doing the work of Jesus Christ. And that's a good example of doing that, and we should keep doing that.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I know I was blessed, and seeing some of the comments and knowing you at home, y'all were blessed as well.
Well, thanks for having me at Keaton Camp Meeting a century later.
Yep. So we hope you all have a blessed afternoon. Take a couple hours, enjoy some time with your family. Maybe pop some popcorn, cut up some fruit, or do whatever you do on Sabbath afternoon. And we're going to be back right here in the studio. Pastor James is going to be joining me with Pastor Bradshaw himself and having a live question and response session with him. So we look forward to seeing you at 7 p.m. tonight.
Happy Sabbath.